It seems like one of the powerful emerging variables in a lot of our conversations around these things is the concept of like preference signaling, right? And it's like when you have a criteria like, how do we increase the fidelity or the accuracy or the authenticity or the verifiability of preference signaling, you now have something to optimize around when you're thinking about designing civic systems, right? And that's fundamentally, it's like, democracy is not a yes no question. It's not do we vote for the president or not. It's like what degree or to what fidelity or to, in what domains of power does our preference signaling come across within the systems that we're operating in, right? I'm just curious if you have any other thoughts on that. Is there any other like key vocabulary or criteria you think is important to explore there?
Yeah, I think it's a really astute question and points to the way in which systems and incentives create their outcomes. So systems are not neutral. The first past the post voting creates a game board landscape that can only end up in two parties. That oh wow. Okay. Yay. Uh
That's a premium feature.
yeah, I know. It's a new MacBook lets you make balloons pop up. But in all seriousness, the the first past the post voting mechanism will inevitably create a two-party system. And so that very reductive expression of preference will lead to these outcomes inevitably because of the pressures that it puts to consolidate power into either one or the other. And over the course of US history, we've seen alternative parties have eventually been consumed by one of the two major parties. And those are just evolutionary pressures created by the way in which the system is designed. And so to have ranked choice voting or quadratic voting or star voting or any number of other preference signaling mechanisms, you would see completely different behaviors from the system. And so it's not like, well, we're just Democrats or Republicans. That's just human nature. It's Coke or Pepsi. Like these are actually the results of systemic drivers and incentives. And if you change those systems and their incentives, you will get different outcomes. And so I think that's just really important for people to understand, to know that we're not like forever stuck in this version of the world. Sometimes this version of the world, like the story that it tells, is that this is what's natural. This is the only way that things can be. But in fact, it's actually because of certain choices downstream. And this is, not to be conspiratorial, but there are people who understand these things. There are people who meet at Jekyll Island who create the Federal Reserve, and they know how this system of currency will affect behaviors, and they've gamed it in their advantage. And so Web3 to me represents an opportunity for us as citizens to say, hey, we don't agree, we don't consent, and we are going to create our own game rules that incentivize different kinds of behaviors because we can. I would love to see someone do an audit of this election and one use like on-chain identity, like through zero knowledge proofs to track the validity of the election, but also run the votes through a different tabulating methodology to see what would be possible if we didn't have first past the post voting, because I think people need to be able to imagine what a world outside of that system would look like in order for us to create it.
That makes sense, and maybe that in part starts to address the next thing I want to talk about, which is like how do we start to implement these things locally, right? Kind of there's almost like a fundamental ethics that's implied that you're invoking about localism, right? In terms of one's ability to represent oneself and the legitimacy of authority. So how do we start to implement systems that allow for that local voice to be heard? And what are you seeing right now being built? What's exciting you in that world?
Yeah, the thing that's most exciting to me, through the work that I'm doing with this regeneration alliance that's forming is the creation of bioregional hubs. And part this comes out of the work of Joe Brewer, which I would encourage people to go check out. Um, and I can share some other links for it as well. But basically, they're equivalent to kind of third spaces, civic spaces that are primarily focused on localizing and creating circular economies, as well as coordinating regenerative agriculture and restoration efforts of watersheds, soil, and ecology. And it'll be quite a heavy lift and a big investment to create this kind of global network of these kinds of spaces. Some, I would say, the biggest proponent of this thus far, they're all based in Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest. They already have a ton of this kind of energy moving and coalescing. So I think they will lead the way in this. But to imagine having a third space that is not oriented towards, it's not like a business incubator, although it could have a business incubator, but it's not like a startup space. It's not a, wellness studio or yoga studio. There's no commodification. It's just a space for community, education, and coordination. And to have a space like that is kind of the metabolic process of the transition, where we're slowly pulling people from one system into another. I think having these kinds of spaces is going to be really essential for that education, upskilling, transition process. And so that's one of the areas that I'm most excited about, because it feels like just by creating the space for it and then equipping people with the tools and the education through that space, then, everything that needs to happen on the planet is so vast and complex that it's only through these kind of infrastructural utilities and education, and then directly empowering people to go off and use them and experiment with them and iterate in their own local communities, that we're going to start seeing the changes happen. So creating those kind of physical third spaces, civic spaces, and empowering people through them. That's what's most inspiring to me.
Mm. I'm pretty curious about that because it's very related to some of the things that I've been thinking about. Specifically, let's say with regard to maintaining an actual space for people in a community to use in a number of ways. How closely are you associated with that, or how closely are you involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, Open Civics is supporting all of these different efforts, which include, how do we create the right funding mechanisms for bioregions, which actually I'm really encouraged to see is actually going in a very decentralized route. Then how do we coordinate with the people who are doing the earth monitoring and the big data collection? And then how do we create governance toolkits for on the ground community organizing? And so Open Civics is kind of helping to facilitate all of those things.
Okay.
But the part that I'm like most inspired by is creating templates for these kinds of hubs, these kind of like modular components that people can
Yeah.
pull off the shelf and utilize.
So yeah, that's really interesting. How many, like as far as templates go, how is that going with the building of the functional templates?
Well, the first step that was required for this process, which I think is a scalable or a repeatable pattern, um, is really doing a broad survey of the design space overall and identifying what are the key infrastructures that are like absolutely necessary in a shared map. So in order to coordinate, you have to do a certain degree of situational awareness building. And so we spent a week just looking at the survey of the landscape and what is needed, and then distilling from that like four general work streams. Within those, like each one having about five different standalone products of infrastructures. And that process is like, that's where we're at. is like we've created the map, we've created the coordination mechanisms for funding the development of each of those pieces. And now it's like actually fundraising to build all of those component pieces. And we're partnering with another really incredible organization on creating the templates for governance, kind of imagining, very similar to the work that meta governance has done, but with a little bit more of the like social process layer built in to help kind of provide almost like a Clippy, like, hey, it looks like your community is in a moment of conflict. Would you like to go through a process to come into consensus together? That kind of a tool.
Mm.
And I'm really curious to know what other projects are out there that are thinking along similar lines, because part of the idea of an open innovation ecosystem, and maybe one of the other pieces I can share about the innovation that we're working on at kind of a meta level is like we're we're actually incorporating a lab that's able to do more like direct consulting and building. And then we've linked that to the consortium, which is a fully decentralized network. And so we want to be able to activate a swarm of innovators to swarm around a design challenge, but also have the affordance of being able to do kind of really hyper focused work where we don't need to like wait for the group to have a consensus meeting about a strategy in order to move. And so we're going to be utilizing both of those instruments in tandem to continue to create infrastructures like this.